Welcome everybody tonight to the library for our penultimate First Wednesday talk of 2013-2014. It is our second to last talk because next month on June 4th, we will host H. Nicholas Mueller, who's retired executive director of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. And he will speak about the famous and controversial Frank Lloyd Wright House, Falling Water. So that'll be the last first Wednesday of the year on the first Wednesday of June. So First Wednesdays, as you know, is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council. It takes place on the first Wednesday of the month, October through May, in 9 libraries across the state. We have a yellow feedback form where you can leave your suggestions. And we're now planning our 2014-2015 year, and there's going to be some great lectures coming your way beginning in October. So sometime in July or August, if you check our online calendar, you'll be able to see what the plan is. And these wonderful lifelong learning events are partially funded by the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library, but they do not do it alone. We have local sponsors who I'd like to recognize: Brattleboro Savings and Loan, the Vermont Country Store, Downs Racklin Martin, New Chapter Inc., and the Vermont Department of Libraries. And tonight we owe special thanks to the Wyndham World Affairs Council of Vermont for being a library sponsor. WWAC has existed as a foreign affairs organization for over 50 years in the county and is dedicated to educating, inspiring, and engaging Americans in international affairs and critical global issues of our times. It is a member of the World Affairs Council of America, which is comprised of 100 councils over 40 states. The national group was founded in 1918 and has grown to be the United States' largest nonprofit international affairs organization. Wyndham World Affairs Council has lectures and other events throughout the year, so you'll definitely want to get on their mailing list. There are members here tonight, and the President Peter Sears is over by the window there, so you can see him. And some board members were routing around in some of the archives, and they came across this, this ledger. And the council actually, first entry is from 1956. And here is the first. Wyndham World Affairs Council invites you to attend its annual dinner and Great Decisions Wind-Up Meeting, Tuesday, May 5th, 1964, which was actually 50 years ago, 2 days ago, at San Donona, the Experiments International Training Center on Black Mountain Road. 6 o'clock, dinner tickets on sale, $2.25. Pretty good. And a report from Dr. Hildegard Durfee, who was one of the founding members of the council. So I'll just pass this around with the permission of the World Affairs Council. You can look through the ledger. You'll probably recognize some names there. Ellsworth Bunker is listed on here as well. So, and now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. Thomas Powers is the author of 9 books. He won the Pulitzer-Prize for National Reporting in 1971 together with Lucinda Franks for his articles on the Weatherman organization, member Diana Houghton, and has contributed to the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, Harper's, The Nation, Commonweal, The Atlantic, and Rolling Stone. His most recent book, The Killing of Crazy Horse, was a National Book Circle Critics Award finalist for biography and the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History. Tom was actually here in October 2011 under the auspices of the Brattleboro Literary Festival to speak about Crazy Horse, so you might have seen him then. He's also an intelligence expert. His other works are The Man Who Kept Secrets, Richard Helms and the CIA, Intelligence Wars, American Secret History from Hitler to Al-Qaeda, and Heisenberg's War, The Secret History of the German Bomb. And this book is widely reviewed, and it inspired British playwright Michael Frayn to write his Tony Award-winning play Copenhagen about the 1941 visit of Werner Heisenberg to Niels Bohr. The play opened in London in 1998 and on Broadway in 2000. It actually played here at Weston Playhouse a couple of years ago. It was a fantastic play. Thomas lives with his wife Candace in Vermont, where he is one of 4 founding partners and editors who established Steerforth Press, a literary trade publishing house. Please welcome Thomas Powers.
Good. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm always glad to talk about military and intelligence matters. I was asked a moment ago how I got interested in writing about Crazy Horse after the other stuff that I had done in previous years, and my answer was, and always is, that the killing of Crazy Horse was in many ways a classic American clandestine operation. It had the earmarks of things that the CIA has done many times. The part that was different was Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse was the thing that particularly attracted me to that particular project. I agreed just about a year ago to come and talk here tonight, and the subject was going to be soft power versus hard power. It grew out of a piece I had written for the New York Review of Books about David Petraeus. Everybody here, I'm sure, will remember that he was a celebrated general, a champion of counterinsurgency, and a man who commanded both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and revolutionized the American way of dealing with the kind of wars that we were actually fighting. He taught himself how to understand modern warfare as a basically political event. And he brought to Iraq first and then Afghanistan later a sense of the totality of ways in which you could address an enemy in the battlefield. And in particular, he was an opponent of the heavy reliance on firepower that was characteristic of the American Army. The American military has pretty much always been the same kind of an organization, the same kind of an institution. It's done everything in a very large way. If you read about the campaigns of Ulysses Grant to win the Civil War, you capture once and for all the classic American way of approaching these things. Big industrial base, mighty army, very heavy firepower, tremendous logistical system. And Petraeus learned that that was not the way to conduct a war of essentially political in nature against an indigenous people as we were facing in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The way he learned this is interesting. He learned it from the French. And when he was a young man in the military, he was a paratrooper, and he was an enthusiast of ranger-type military activity. And he went to France on an assignment where he spent a lot of time with French troops. And there he ran into people who knew a lot about how the French had learned to fight in Indochina. And that started him reading, and one of the books he read was a novel called The Centurions by Jean Lartiguet, which was all about the political nature of war. So that's what Petraeus devoted his life to trying to teach the Americans to do. Now, when he was a young man, the United States was still only just in the process of leaving Vietnam, where we had done everything the wrong way. And Petraeus knew this because essentially the French had told him. Very early in that war, General William Westmoreland, you can't, I've got it on. Okay. General William Westmoreland, who is in command of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV, was asked at a press conference, what's the right way to fight a counterinsurgency? How are you going to do it? And he said, in one word, firepower. And he had an assistant, General William Dupuy, and General William Dupuy expanded on this, and he told reporters and anybody who would listen, we're going to stomp them to death. And what he meant was that very heavy, classic, American, all-out, no-holds-barred way of attacking an enemy and destroying them. Now, what Petraeus brought to counterinsurgency and to Afghanistan was not exactly what Joseph Nye, the Harvard professor, called and meant by soft power. But it was similar. It was political in nature. Nye meant all the various ways in which you can persuade people to share your goals and fight alongside of you, and become an ally through what it amounts to sweet talk and gentle cajolery and occasional use of convenient and discreet funds and that sort of thing. But Petraeus took that quite a bit further and pressed very hard for a widespread program of economic assistance, job creation, moving the army out into the population, putting it on the ground, not retiring into fortified bases or isolating themselves from the people of the country where they were, but to become an active participant. And until very recently, part of the standard debate in this country about military matters and about the right way to conduct war was a comparison and contrasting of soft power versus hard power. The softer political ways, which can be expanded to include the sort of coercion, but short of military action, that the United States has used with Iran in an attempt to persuade or force Iran to abandon its nuclear development program. But everything changed recently with the Ukraine. And if you've been following the news, you will have seen, you will have heard kind of between the lines just what a shocking event the Russian invasion of and seizure of Crimea was for the entire, now again, Western world. In the United States, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, especially Germany. It raises many very awkward and difficult questions, and it doesn't take very long thinking about what's going on there to realize that it would be very difficult, very, very difficult to get the Russians to reverse themselves and to abandon what they have already accomplished, which is the reincorporation of Crimea into the Russian state. Hard military power could conceivably do it, but nobody recommends that. Nobody wants that. Nobody believes there would be anything gained by any such approach. And it doesn't take very long thinking about the forces that are involved and the countries that are involved, and Russia in particular, and the character of the man who runs it, to know that soft power is not going to force them to do anything or persuade them to do anything. So we're confronting a fait accompli that has really changed the world situation very radically just in the last few months. Now, as I said, no one wants to use force to try and get the Russians to reverse themselves. But if you stop and think about it, you can see that it's too late. In fact, the Russians adopted a policy of dependence on essentially political means to carry out this campaign of theirs, which created facts on the ground before anybody had fully noticed what was happening. Russia didn't go into Crimea the way Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait and in 1990. He sort of slipped in, he filtered in, he kind of pilfered the state. It's almost a case of international shoplifting. He just arrived there with Soviet forces, all of whom had, or most of whom had Ukrainian connections. And he had a clandestine apparatus inside Ukraine that was supportive of his policy and the goals that he had, and was there to create facts on the ground and essentially to create a local crisis which was too great for local authorities to deal with. So just as a simple matter of fact, Russia has annexed and reabsorbed the Crimea, and it is in the process of getting very close to doing the same thing in Ukraine as a whole, working one piece at a time. Now, anybody that wants to sort of get a sense of what's happening at the moment, I would recommend that you take a look at a map. And a map of the Ukraine, you'll see that Crimea is barely attached to the rest of Ukraine at all, just a very narrow neck of land. And Crimea is almost as closely attached to Russia. Just a little short stretch of water separates the two in the east. And Crimea used to be a part of Russia for internal political reasons. Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine in the 1950s. From his point of view, it didn't make any difference. It was all part of the greater Russian sphere of influence and the Federation of Soviet Socialist Republics. Ukraine without Crimea is still fundamentally Ukraine. But the next step in the Russian campaign was quite bold, very aggressive, on the pugnacious end of the spectrum, and involves eastern Ukraine, which is the industrial part of Ukraine, and of course the basis of their modern economy, such as it is. And there again, the pattern has been the same. Initially, local Russian-speaking allies of Russia, of Moscow, have created crises in local areas that are too big for local authorities to deal with. They've established themselves in public buildings where they cannot easily be rooted out. And they have made large political demands and with Russian support have loudly denounced all attempts by the Ukrainian government in Kiev to end those occupations or to end that unrest that they've been creating. And Putin has been regularly saying that something like a civil war is approaching, and that, of course, he would send troops into this neighboring territory to defend Russian-speaking people who identified with Russia if it needed to be done to save them. So there's a strong threat there. But if you look at the map, eastern Ukraine stretches to the Dnieper River, where the capital city is divided by the river, Kiev, and they would, Ukraine without the eastern Ukraine would be a very, very diminished political entity, a very, very diminished state. And it would be difficult to imagine its continued independence and certainly its continued economic vigor and active political life. But that still hasn't ended quite there. If you look at the map, look at Odessa. Odessa is on the Black Sea. It's in the extreme western part of Ukraine. It's close to Moldova, another large territory that was hived off at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Moldova is full of Russian-speaking people, many of them actually Russians, and they too can be said to want to rejoin Russia. Now suddenly we've got somebody, territory to the east of Ukraine, and is a large place. It's close to the west. It's nestled right up next to the west. So there's nothing the United States or the other countries of Europe are prepared to or ready to or eager to do to prevent this from happening. It's essentially something that Putin can do on his own. It's within his power to just simply take those final steps and reabsorb that large piece of territory. With what effect on his psychology is troubling to imagine. A success of that kind can derange a national leader, and you just don't know where something like that might go next. If you step back a little and look at a still bigger map, you look at Belarus just to the north of Ukraine, and then to the east, there's Poland. And it's important to remember that in the last 400 years, Poland has really been an independent country only for two brief periods, one 1918 to 1945, and more recently 1989 until the present. All the rest of that time, Poland was part of Russia, and they completely controlled it and administered it and exploited it. And somewhere deep in the Russian soul is the notion that they kind of still own Poland. That's somehow still theirs. Now, Putin hasn't said anything about making an approach on Poland, but you can be sure that Poland is thinking about it, and you can be sure that people in Washington who think about national security stuff, they're all thinking about that. And the Germans have been speaking in a very reasonable tone of voice about the many logical ways in which Russia has some right on its side because of the existence of this large Russian-speaking population and their hostility to the nature of the government that has emerged or is emerging in Kiev. And all of those things suggest that it's much on the minds of the chancellors of Europe, as they used to be called. Up until the Crimea was seized by Russia, there was a certain peace of mind seemed to rule European international power politics. And that is gone. And it's not going to be recovered anytime soon. It's just a fact that period where people felt relatively secure and safe from irrational military conflicts on a continental level, that just went out the window with the seizure of Crimea. And as much as everybody would like to just have it go away, just somehow come to an agreement that Crimea is enough, or maybe Crimea plus Eastern Ukraine will resolve this temporary problem and things can then resume the way they were. That's not actually the way people in military establishments think. Once you raise a doubt in their mind about what a national leader is thinking about or planning to do or hoping to do, they just can't forget that. They just think about that all the time. And that question, what do you do? What are you going to do? What are the actual alternatives? In what way would the Western countries persuade Russia not to think about that or to, much less do it or do any of it or do any more of it? The soft power considerations don't come into it at all. We are trying some of those expanded notions of military alternatives that Petraeus believes in and that Petraeus used with good effect in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and which our government has used with considerable effect against Iran when we've imposed economic sanctions. And if you're one of the people who reads to the end of the stories in the New York Times, you'll discover that a lot of thought has gone into those sanctions, and they're nowhere near as strong as they could be, and they're nowhere near as painful for Russia as they could be. And the people who are designing the sanctions and thinking up what to do to try and make their feelings known are careful not to push it too far. There are a lot of people in Russia now who are very active in business and amassed great wealth, and it's at risk in this situation. And they have some say, they have some access to the ear of Putin. The sanctions are intended to alarm, concern, and frighten them, but not frighten them to death. And they're enough to make Putin think twice about whether this is really going to be worth it in the long run, but they're not enough to make him pugnacious and fighting mad and determined to have his way no matter what. So it's still very early days for those attempts. But once you start down that road, which we, I believe, have started down, there's no predicting where the end of it will be. And what military establishments always do is, well, what have we got? What can we actually put into the battle? Now, Poland, as everybody knows, is a member of NATO. We are fully committed to the independence of Poland. And I believe that we will be making that quite clear as time goes by, slowly but effectively. And one of the most effective ways is you start paying attention to your arms situation, to your military power. You start beefing things up. You start investing in new programs. And if we do that, the Russians will be compelled to do the same thing. So we're at the beginning of a period which could, in certain important ways, come to resemble the old Cold War. How deep into that period will go is, I certainly don't know. I don't have any really deep intuition about how it'll develop. All I know is that we've made a compass change. The direction is somewhat different. The attitudes have altered, and military establishments are asking themselves, well, what have we got? What can we actually do? There's a moment in Petraeus's life that always interested me. Very early during the campaign to overthrow Saddam Hussein in 2003, Petraeus was with one of the columns that was marching to the north into Iraq. And at some point along the way, he turned to a journalist who happened to be there next to him and talking to him. And he said, "Tell me how this ends. 8 years and 8 divisions?" Now, everybody who's deeply schooled in modern American military history will remember that phrase and that expression from the 1950s. And that's the answer that General Matthew B. Ridgway gave to President Eisenhower in 1954 when there was discussion of coming to the aid of the French at Dien Bien Phu, where the French were about to be overrun and lose the war against the Viet Minh. And Eisenhower asked Ridgway, what would it take? And he said, 8 years and 8 divisions. And I had a very short answer that contained a large implication. First of all, Eisenhower basically felt that that was about right. That's what it would take. Second of all, no way was the United States going to put 8 divisions into a military operation for 8 years so the French could continue to own Indochina. It was not going to happen. And there was never any chance that that would happen. So there was a realism there about what countries will do. But as we know from bitter personal experience, you can make a mistake about these things. And you can trip and fall and slip into them, even when you don't want to. So what Petraeus asked that journalist was, where are we going? What's coming down the road in our direction here? We've initiated this thing, and now what? And somewhere in the Soviet or the Russian military hierarchy, somebody is wondering the same thing now. What's involved here? How far are we going to have to go to defend this policy? How much is it worth to us? And the more that we have to spend to defend it, not necessarily in military activity itself of the sort we call war, but in just economic preparation and just psychological obsession with the threat. How much is it going to cost us? And it needs to be, it's my hope, I'm sure it's shared by everybody in this room, that the answer in Russian military circles will be, well, it's going to be the equivalent of 8 years and 8 divisions. Don't do it. Don't go any further. Stop here. Now this is an interesting moment where things have changed in a kind of profound way without anything really big happening yet. Anything that's unmistakable or anything that we all know we have to live with for the duration. But that's I think, likely to be the case. And with that, I'll stop my pointed remarks and invite questions from the audience about anything you're interested in. Yeah.
How do we enlist the enthusiastic support of our customary Western European allies when they're so dependent on Russian gas?
Well, it's tough. My advice would be don't push too hard, don't press too hard, don't insist too hard. It'll come to them. They're worried about this. Putin has, the basic rule of international affairs is, the line you never cross is, don't change borders with armies. Just don't do that. And Putin has done it. And when you do something like that, it just changes the whole situation. It's like being at a cocktail party where a guy gets mad, and instead of just, stalking out, he slugs the host. Everything's different then, and everybody knows it, and that guy is never going to be treated quite the same way again. That moment, part of his life is over. And Putin has done that. And so I think our allies in Europe are probably thinking about it twice as much as we are, because we have a big military, but they do not. Yeah.
I've heard several commentators saying that, saying that it might be possible for eastern and southern Ukraine to separate from the rest of Ukraine and be maybe a federated system so that they would be a little more close to Russia and the western part of Ukraine to Europe. In other words, it sounded as though some people feel that there could be an agreement of some kind so that it's not an all or nothing.
I agree with that. And of course, I hope something like that will be what comes to pass. And that would certainly be in Russia's interest to settle for that. Put Ukraine in a very, very damaged, limited, and struggling situation. But the rest of the world could live with it for sure. And it might work, but it wouldn't change the fundamental nature of the moment. Putin has done something that nobody's done for a long time in Europe. And everyone's going to respond on the basis of the fact. And it will be very hard to reassure them with just some kind of papered over little situation. He sent troops into Crimea. He seized that piece of country. And he's come awful close to doing the same in eastern Ukraine. I mean, there are Russian soldiers in there, lots of them.
But Crimea had a bunch of Russian bases there. In other words, Crimea was quasi under Russian influence anyway.
They can get away with Crimea, but it still changes the psychology of the moment. Yeah?
I'd like to really think outside the box, but to the point where my question, I'm sure that people who do this for a living and who are career analysts would probably think it ridiculous, but I'll say it anyway. It seems to me that or it occurs to me that with all the talk about the natural gas from Russia being such an integral part of European economy and becoming more integrated that way, I'm wondering why do we, and having heard some talk by leftist commentators in the nation, Stephen Cohen in particular, that NATO precipitated this crisis to a certain extent by aggressively moving along the borders more than usual. I'm wondering, has anybody considered getting rid of NATO or integrating Russia into NATO and just saying, look, why Russia and NATO, why make Ukraine choose between the European Union and the Russian Union that precipitated this thing? Why not just say, look, the Cold War is over and we're in a new world, and let Russia be, forget NATO and just have an integrated Europe where their natural gas and people sell to each other and instead of choosing between Russia and the West?
Well, people do think about things like that. Stephen Cohen's not the only one by any means, and they've been thinking about it for a long time. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a kind of a general invitation to Russia to join NATO and to become part of that system if they wanted to. But Putin would never want to do that, because once you do that, you have to, if you become part of the European Union, you got to follow their rules. And a lot of those rules have to do with how political power is divided up and how the law works and a lot of other things that Putin would not like to alter for the convenience of the West. So I don't think he would be an enthusiastic joiner. And as a practical matter, the time to dissolve an alliance is when the horizon is absolutely clear, blemishless, no worry beyond in sight anywhere. Not 10 minutes after one of the guys has just suddenly invaded another country. Yeah.
At 6 o'clock before we came here, we were watching PBS, or the public television network, where the lead discussion was about Putin's words after the bloodshed of Russian troops and Russian peoples yesterday in the Ukraine, in Odessa, that he was going to withdraw forces from the Ukraine. And the scholars who were interviewed were doubting or hoping that those words were indeed true. Could this be a game changer?
Well, sure. Backing off and pulling back and surrendering the point and changing your tone and that kind of thing can change things if you stick to it. We'd have to wait and see. Not too long ago, an agreement was reached in Switzerland that the separatists were going to leave the buildings in eastern Ukraine, and then the crisis was going to be defused, and Putin was behind it and for it, and it just didn't happen. I mean, maybe this will happen. We all want things like that to happen, and typically when crises of this sort unfold, there's a lot of backing and forthing as they go, but they have a kind of a logic to them. And Putin has made a very large investment in changing the status quo there. Now, I hadn't seen any sign that he's given up on that, and I would be surprised if he did in a hurry. So I expect it to be tense for a long time, with moments of real tension and then moments of hope. We all remember the Cold War. I mean, there were moments where everybody thought it was going to be settled at the negotiating table. That never happened. Yes.
Tom, there's a case of Russian soft power last year that I have not been able to find satisfactorily discussed. And it was at the time when Obama was showing himself to be very reluctant to get drawn into the Syrian situation. But he made the exception for if chemical weapons were to be introduced, that would be a line that could not be crossed. And sure enough, in due course, they were. But by whom is, of course, still open to debate. And we went through this period of tension and anguish where Obama was patently backed into a corner, had to do something, didn't seem to be any obvious resolution or course of action for him, and then suddenly, out of the blue, Syria declared itself ready to surrender its stockpile of chemical weapons. And I think this got handed to Kerry, who was in Europe at the time, I think quite quickly, and so there was a sort of superficial glow around Kerry for having come up with this, but clearly it could not have occurred to any degree without Russian, at least, influence and probably instigation and insistence. And if that was the case, I thought, well, boy, does Obama owe Putin one for this. And I never really saw that discussed, and I've never really seen the card very visibly played by the Russians, but I'm wondering if it isn't a little bit part of the current scenario in Europe.
Well, that's an interesting point. Exactly why Putin did that, of course, I don't know. And there are many possible reasons why he would have done it, but it's not clear to him. But it's the kind of thing that you would hope that occasionally would happen from somebody on the other side at a tense moment. And certainly that was a moment where mistakes of a major kind could have been blundered into or made. I mean, Obama was under tremendous pressure to do something, but nobody really wanted to do it. It wasn't just Obama who had previously not wanted to do it. You know, the Republicans didn't want to do it, and the Democrats didn't want to do it. And you have to have a groundswell of support for something like that. So Putin did do us a favor there, and I imagine that there are others that could be cited as well. But you know, it's like Hollywood. What'd you do for me yesterday? And this is now with a new deck of cards that is being played by the two sides. Yeah.
First, I have a question, point of information, then I'd like to make a comment.
Okay.
When the Soviet Union broke up, why did Ukraine break up into a separate country rather than stay with Russia?
Ukraine was a separate country, theoretically. It was a Soviet Socialist Republic, and it was part of the Federation. The Soviet Union was a federation of states. So it already was a separate country, only this time it became really separate. And the apparatus that held the Soviet Union together and that carried out common Soviet policies and so on, all that evaporated at that time.
Okay, why do you think now then that Putin wants it back, at least Crimea and maybe the whole thing? What is his driving motivation that you think behind his strong desire, backed by military power, to take it all back or some of it back? And is it based on the fact that he's concerned about the Russian-speaking people? Are they actually in the minority rather than the majority? Does he have any basis saying they're being persecuted and so on? Or is it brute power? It's a nice chance to have more rather than less.
You know, I don't actually really think it's either of those two things. I'm inclined to think it has more to do with the nature of his political system. And it's actually a lot like Stalin. He's not a Stalin type of figure, at least we've seen no evidence of it yet. But Stalin's power was most secure when the state was the most threatened. And it's that adversarial relationship that is very stabilizing in a certain way internally in Russia. And Putin has, opponents there, and there are political strains there that he cannot fully control. But when you're under attack and under assault, then your ability to maintain control is much enhanced. And I think that is what it actually has to do. He's actually more comfortable. And plus, he doesn't want to do any of the things that the rest of the world thinks a modern democracy should do. So this makes it easier for him to just simply say no, in the same way that Stalin always said no to those things. Yeah.
I have two parts of one question that are related to the people Putin is in fact dealing with or allied with, or his clients. One is, do you think there's any sense that the Russian-speaking political elements and paramilitary elements in Ukraine, whether Putin has complete control over what they're doing in eastern Ukraine or in Ukraine in general, and could there be difficulties if he can't control that? And then secondly, is it possible that he is breeding other client people in Kazakhstan or in any of the other former SSRs to do similar things that could create maybe a multi-front problem for the West?
Well, certainly the latter would have everybody on total alert. You know, one more country and something like the Cold War will be in full force again. Controlling allies can be tough. The United States has had plenty of trouble with that at various times and places. One of the reasons we invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs was because we didn't know what to do with the army we had created to do it. We didn't know. It was the safest place to send it was to Cuba. That was an argument that was actually dispositive in the White House. But we're talking about Russia here, and they're very good at discipline. And the stuff that I've seen about the separatists strongly suggests these are essentially military people, and so they're in and under a chain of command, and the Russian style is not to put up with any crap. So I don't think that would be very likely to be the way things would get out of control. Be more likely that Putin would make some other kind of a larger mistake that other people wouldn't tolerate, and then the mistakes are going to be mostly his, I think. Yeah.
Petraeus did lots of good things in Iraq and Afghanistan. You said he learned it from the French. Why did he pay attention to the French since they lost at Dien Bien Phu?
Well, that's a good question. It's what they learned at Dien Bien Phu. I urge you to read The Centurions, if you can get your hands on a copy, which is not that easy. And it's a lot of it takes place in the prison camp where French military officers from Dien Bien Phu were taken. And these French officers went through a kind of a re-education program at the hands of the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh not only dealt with them very harshly, but they explained to them where they had gone wrong. And they explained to them why they had won. And they had won because they had the political support of the people. And the French lost because they did not have the political support of the people. And they explained how you get the political support of the people and how you actually run a campaign like that. You don't actually have to be Vietnamese in order to do that successfully. But you do have to understand what it is you're trying to do and who your real allies are going to be and have to be. Those French officers then went to Algeria, and they were very successful against the Algerian independence movement for a while. But at a certain point, the political problems of that campaign were so high that the French government no longer wanted to keep doing it. And so they're the ones who gave up in Algeria. But Petraeus met a lot of these people personally. And he got to know the guy who ran that Algerian campaign. If any of you have ever seen a film called, Battle of Algiers. That's a quite marvelous film about how that was done. And the guy who ran that and completely destroyed the independence movement in the city became a kind of a friend of Petraeus, and they had conversations, and he did a lot of reading. Petraeus is a great reader. William Westmoreland, not so much. And he actually had a copy of The Centurions on his bedside table with other reading matter for the entire time that he was in Vietnam. And he told a Time reporter once that he was too busy to really read it, and besides, when he got into bed at night, he was too tired. So he just didn't open himself to that. But there's a whole serious body of literature about fighting political wars. And it's very useful and instructive. And not only to people who were trying to control foreign populations, but for people who were trying to free themselves from foreign domination. A man named Fred Kaplan wrote a book largely about Petraeus's campaign to change the U.S. Army fighting doctrine where counterinsurgency was concerned. Fred Kaplan's book was called The Insurgents. And if you're interested in this stuff, there's a lot of great material in there, and it's extremely interesting. Yeah.
Before Russia went into Crimea, the deposing of Yanukovych and the new government that went into Ukraine, that preceded this land grab. How did that play a role, and why doesn't that discredit the Ukrainian position?
Well, the Ukrainians get to have their own politics. And in theory, I mean, other people take an interest, and we certainly take an interest in other countries' politics very often. But the Russians didn't have a right to determine what kind of a government there was going to be in Kiev. And there was a real split in the country. There's no question that it actually existed. It's not like it's a simple matter at all. And the real split is between people who naturally incline to the West and the people who naturally incline to the East, and actually have this kind of a sentimental regret for the loss of the Soviet system. It's obvious that those two mindsets are going to have a tough time getting along in one parliament, and they did. Now, why that struggle took place and unfolded exactly the way it did, will be the subject of fat books in the future, I'm sure. But it was a legitimate, large-scale, long-term, activist political event in Ukraine. And the fact that a government came to power there that people in the East didn't like is a source of trouble and difficulty, and would to God it had been handled wisely by everybody concerned, but it wouldn't normally be accepted as a reason why a neighboring state could just march in. The Soviet preparations to march in seemed so clear and so specific and so artfully designed for that place and those circumstances that you got to think they've been working on this for a while. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, why didn't people notice that more?
It's a good question, and people should have noticed it a little bit more, and Western European countries and the United States all should have been really paying attention there. And maybe they could have worked out some kind of a understanding, or softened the process of change, or somehow reassured people in the East. It's evident that the Western Ukrainians were giving Russian speakers in the East a hard time, and denying them all kinds of basic rights of the sort that the Quebecois now assume are theirs and are granted. So it could have been handled smarter, and it should have been. But I mean, we almost always say that, don't we, after anything really goes wrong? Yes?
Isn't it a bit confusing to refer to people as Russian speakers? Everybody in Ukraine speaks Russian. They may or may not speak Ukrainian. And so, I mean, there's a large Russian population. My understanding is that Stalin, moved people around precisely so there would be, Russians in all these other republics.
I don't know quite what to call them.
Yeah.
They're
Russians.
They live in Ukraine,
Yeah.
and many of them have lived in there for generations, but they still think of themselves as being somehow Russian,
Yeah.
but they're not. Well, they are and they aren't.
Yeah. But some of the military people who are fighting now are they're not necessarily from outside. I mean,
Some of the military
seems
people
to
who are
be
fighting
both.
now are not necessarily from the outside, but these are military people who, for the most part, I think it seems clear, have actually spent time in the Russian military in Russia. Yes.
Going back to the war on terror in the Middle East in general, when you talk about the exertion of soft power, how do you think organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, National Republican Institute, USAID, how are those organizations manifesting in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in the Middle East? And how does Chuck Hagel relate to this concept of using the soft power, the traditional soft power in that region, as opposed to military action? What do you see as...
Well, I think Chuck Hagel has made it pretty clear. He's definitely not in favor of further military action in the Middle East, so far as I can tell. Our policy now is to get out of Afghanistan, basically. We've already left Iraq. We have resisted temptations to go into Syria. We did not fully involve ourselves in Libya. Many opportunities for meddling in Egypt have all been turned down, except on the most clandestine level. So I think Hagel and the military in general, they're tired of this. This has been a fruitless campaign. When Bush went into Iraq, he did not understand what he was doing in a very profound way. He did not understand it was going to cost $1 trillion, which might have been spent on something else. It certainly would have been spent on something else. And he did not see, and nobody around him apparently saw or told him, that he was going to be taking power from a Sunni minority and giving it to a Shiite majority that had a close political and emotional relationship to Iran, which is the one country we've probably been mad at longer than any other. I mean, it takes your breath away that happened there. Yeah.
Somewhere I heard someone say that, in fact, all the factories that make all the parts for the Russian military enterprise were in eastern Ukraine. If that's true, and I were Russia, I would think seriously about wanting to control eastern Ukraine. And if I were the West, I would think about a way to destroy those factories if Russia moved into Ukraine. Is that something we might be thinking about?
Not in the short term. No. No, I mean, I don't know whether that's true about all that stuff being made there. I don't know. I don't know. Could be. And certainly that'd be the kind of thing that would motivate them. And they had their principal naval base and have had for 150 years in Crimea. So that comes as no surprise that they have a keen interest. But they had made their possessive interest there felt, and it was recognized, and it was not really in danger, but it was probably about as iffy as our control of Guantanamo. Yeah.
Isn't the reestablishment of the Cold War playing into the hands of the military-industrial complex for the United States? To have an adversarial pseudo-enemy as Putin, all it does is just reestablish we're in no way or means ever going to unwind our military spending.
I think that's probably right. I mean, you can be sure that there are all kinds of guys who are sitting in planning rooms at every big, defense contractor in the country thinking about what's the Pentagon going to need next. I mean, that's their business. That's what they do. And that's an argument that we've all been having I've been listening to it since I was 10.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? There's a substantial body of thought written by people who have no illusions about the destructiveness of Stalinism that takes the position that the Cold War was in fact unnecessary and was conducted for other purposes, which had to do with the United States' attempt after World War II to control as much of the world as it could. This is I guess, what you might call revisionist history. And so, the Soviet Union lost its empire, despite their evils, from their perspective, in a very humiliating way. And the United States, our government, and a lot of intellectuals bragged about how we had won the Cold War. So my question is, shouldn't we be looking more closely at what has created, not so much the character of Putin, but Putinism, and what creates it, and what we might have done, and yet might do, using your soft power analogy, to prevent the kind of dynamics where I feel that we may be, despite the real dangers, reintroducing a total irrational stance in which we play as much of a role in the fear of war and fear of destructiveness as our adversaries.
Well, it's always good to hold that possibility in your mind and to think about it on a regular basis, just to maintain your sense of balance. So I'm in favor of all that. But there are certain kinds of behaviors that can never be undone. And you can't be ignored. Like if you were to spend some time reading about how the Communist Party took power in Hungary and how it consolidated that power, and the show trials that they had, and the executions of completely innocent persons and stuff like that, large numbers of them, and I mean just wholesale arrests, and I mean just unbelievable stuff. You can't.
I'm aware of all that.
I know somebody. You can't ignore that. When a country does that.
I'm not ignoring it. The question I'm asking is, what role do we play in this, and how we might have in the past, and how we might today, knowing full well that there's been atrocities committed.
Well, we played a very activist role at the beginning of the Cold War, and at a certain point, you know, after the Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria were all taken over and had regimes imposed on them, our basic position was, no, that's the end, no more. You can't have Greece, you can't have Italy, you can't have France, no. And the peoples of Europe didn't want that either. I mean, there was a big fight about it, and we won the fight. And I've never felt that, oh, how happy they would all be if we'd lost the fight. Once the fight gets going, you can't just talk people out of it. It takes a big fact to change the nature of that adversarial relationship. And one of the things that worries me about Crimea is that it has the potential to become a fact of that magnitude. I think Jerome.
But those facts are not facts. They are interpretations of events. And so we are fed, in a way, we are fed a certain pre-digested way to look at what happened in Crimea and what is happening in the Ukraine. In other words, there seems to be often an overreaction in an all or nothing way rather than partial ways. And one other thing I wanted to say, isn't it possible on a political level to try to see the point of view of the other person?
Sure.
Couldn't we try to see Putin's point of view? He said to Bush, Ukraine is Russian. So he has a point of view that is not sinister necessarily, it's just a point of view. And we have to ask him to see our point of view, etc.
Well, I'm certain we have to ask him to see our point of view. And we do have to make an attempt to see his point of view, because otherwise you can't understand it. And we do make an attempt to understand it. But you got to be careful about, everybody's responsible for their own actions. So if I'm mad at somebody and I take a poke at him, he's responsible for whatever he said, but I'm responsible for the poke, no matter what he said. Now, other people may all gather around and say, oh gosh, I don't blame him a bit. You know, that guy really deserved a poke. But I'm the poker. And Putin here, in this case, he's the poker. He's the guy who just did it. And he didn't ask anybody's permission. He was very determined on his own to do this, and he spent a lot of time planning it. And the idea that he was overwhelmed by sentimental attachment to Russians and Crimea, no, it's much more to do with the naval base and maybe with the military factories in the east of Ukraine. I don't know, but wherever it was, that's the one thing you're not supposed to do in international relations. You don't send troops across people's borders. Period. All right.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.